To morning manna. Let me get some things set here. I'm gonna be talking today out of the fifth chapter of the book of Jeremiah, starting in chapter 20 or verses 21 and 22. After a pretty lengthy description throughout the first 20 verses of all the terrible things that were starting to be considered normal, uh, in this, in this, in these verses, the Lord talks to Jeremiah and sends them to Israel, saying, "Now declare this in the house of Jacob and proclaim it to Judah, saying, Hear this now, O foolish people, without understanding, who have who have eyes and not see, and who have ears and hear not. Do you not fear me, says the Lord? Will you not tremble at my presence, who have placed the sand as the bound of the sea? By perpetual decree, it cannot pass beyond it. And though its waves toss to and fro, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over it." Here in these few verses, God is pointing to nature as evidence to his power and his authority, something that he had done in other books of the Bible and in other places. But before we jump into those places, let's think for just a minute. Last night I was sitting in my living room, this very living room, and I was watching some YouTube videos with my oldest daughter, Samara, and Marla. And we had typed in man versus nature fails. And, we saw some pretty incredible things. We saw a car getting overtaken by a car, row of cars being overtaken by avalanches ski resort. We saw a car being swallowed up by lava. We saw hail, a lot of hail, from golf ball size. There was one guy that was driving and he was filming, and there was golf ball size hail. And in a matter of 10 seconds, his window, you could not see through it. It was just destroyed. And to the point where he was no longer filming, he was hiding in his car looking for shelter. Some more hail videos showed hail that was baseball size that had gone through the roof and through the ceiling of the people filming it. But probably the most impressive one that we saw, it was a aerial view of a guy's farm that was next to the ocean. And it was his farmhouse, and there's a couple of houses around it, and the whole area was sliding into the sea. It was a rainstorm, or it looked like a landslide, and it literally looked like his house and the houses and the buildings around it were on a table, and the tablecloth was being slowly pulled off into the ocean. It was terrible. It was awe-inspiring. And that's what happens whenever there's a contest between man and nature. Man loses every single time. And in these verses that we read in Jeremiah, through the prophet, God is telling his people that he controls nature, that he has true power and authority. Because you see, they had forgotten. And because they had forgotten, they had let themselves become entangled in sin, so much so that the sin became normal. But this forgetfulness of God's sovereignty, that the Lord reigns, as the psalmist declares in the first verse of chapter 99, not only opens the door to sin, as we read in Jeremiah, but it opens the door to despair by questioning God, that we saw months ago in the book of Job on Wednesday nights. Yet Job had suffered. He had gone through some terrible, terrible things, and he and his friends were wrestling over why, the sovereignty of God, God's justice. And in chapter 38, God responds by he again pointing to nature, saying basically, if you know so much, Job and Job's friends, you tell me this. And what he's referring to is the power of nature, uh, that, that that he is the creator. So when we foolishly forget that God reigns, we open ourselves not only to sin, to despair, but even a frantic worriedness. We can get all bent out of shapes about the politics of our land. And I'm not saying that politics don't matter or that we shouldn't bother, but the book of Daniel in chapter 2, verse 21, the Bible declares that he, this is speaking of God, changes the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. So, and let us not forget in all of this that Daniel at the time was serving under a pagan king. The Israel and Judah were already destroyed. He was in a pagan land serving under a king that was not at all a believer, and he was forced to serve this king as a wise man. And continuing on, he says, David or Daniel writes, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. You see, Daniel wasn't foolish enough to forget even when the circumstances weren't what he wanted, that God still reigns. How much more should we be encouraged to not forget? Paul in the book of Romans, he wrote, if God is for us, who can be against us? So God is sovereign. The Lord reigns and his will be done. And we can rest in this because he is a king, but not just a king that doesn't care or a king that doesn't see. Jesus himself confirms that when he told his followers, are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your father's will. But the very hairs of your head are numbered. So do not fear, therefore. You are way more valuable, or you are more valuable than many sparrows. God is sovereign. God is reigning. And even in stormy times, I love there's a song that came out a few years ago that talked about that the wind and the waves still know his name. And so as we go through circumstances in our lives, let us not be foolish enough to forget that God is still in control. He is still on the throne. Because when we do that, we open the door to worry, open the door to sorrow, to doubt, and even to sin. So let us be conscious of this in this day. And I hope that you have a great day. And we'll talk